Author, attorney, Fox News legal analyst Gregg Jarrett is today's speaker for Advocates for Balance at Chautauqua. Mr. Barrett has been with Fox since 2002. Prior to that, he served as an anchor at MSNBC, which I'm thinking he should leave off his resume. And Court TV. During his 8 years at Court TV, he covered the trials of O.J. Simpson, the Menendez brothers, William Kennedy Smith, Jeffrey Dahmer, Rodney King, and Marv Albert. Jarrett is the author of 4 books. His latest 2 books are available for purchase at the Chautauqua bookstore, and they are right behind me. One is The Trial of the Century, and he'll talk about that when he gets up there. This is the Scopes trial, and this one, the latest one, The Constitution of the United States. And I said to him, I can get the Constitution of the United States anywhere. Why would I buy that book? He said, because I annotate it. We have 63 documents in there, and I explain why this is important, you know, what the meaning of this is. So it's not just the Constitution of the United States, it's a whole thing. And look at a big, thick book besides, okay? Jarrett has said it was in fact, Clarence Darrow's defense of free speech at the trial proceedings that influenced him to become an attorney himself. So his topic today is lawfare, the weaponization of the U.S. legal system, how and why. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Gregg Jarrett. Okay, you're good to go. Go ahead.
I don't need a microphone. I got a big voice. Thank you so much for being here. Some people are standing. I wish there were enough chairs. I brought my cell phone along. My oldest daughter got married on Saturday, and she just arrived on her honeymoon in Antigua, so she's sending me pictures. If I were on a honeymoon, contacting my parents would be the last thing I'd do. I've been married 31 years. We didn't have a honeymoon. I was launching a new show literally, the next Monday. And of course, my wife reminds me constantly that she never had a honeymoon. But I'm glad that we could... I'm glad I could come here. I feel like I, was in the neighborhood. The wedding was in Larchmont, Westchester, beautiful waterfront outdoor wedding, 200 guests, which means I have to sell a lot more books. It got so out of hand, you know this, parents out here, there's a budget, and the budget gets blown through in a nanosecond. And so, yes, go to your local bookstore and fund my daughter's wedding, if you would. Here's what I'm going to do. I have some prepared remarks, then I'm going to sit in the chair and talk extemporaneously about the 4 principal lawfare cases against Donald Trump. And then I'll take your questions. And, the reason I wanted to talk about lawfare is because it's the new word in the American lexicon, thanks to 4 criminal cases brought against Donald Trump, the civil fraud case in New York brought against Trump, a variety of other cases brought against. If that's for me, just tell him I'm busy. And I was I'm so happy to be here. This was on my bucket list to come to Chautauqua. I first learned about Chautauqua when I was in high school. In the play Inherit the Wind, William Jennings Bryan character, there's a reference to his being on the Chautauqua circuit. I was telling Paul this last night. He gave me a ride from the airport. And, nobody knew what it was. And the drama teacher said, well, do you know what that is? And he explained it to us. And then I went to the library and I looked it up. And I saw some beautiful pictures. And I said, I got to go to this place. Finally, and high school was 50 years ago, finally I am here. and I took a walk around today, and it is absolutely breathtaking. It is everything I thought it would be. And so thank you for having me here to speak to you. I warn you that I'm going to be 70 years old in a few months, so I let it all hang out now. I don't sugarcoat it. I don't have enough time left in my life to sugarcoat things. So I may be a little outspoken, so I hope that won't offend any of you. But I see this mass hysteria taking place, that it's the end of democracy if Donald Trump is reelected. And I dropped in on John Meacham, who is a wonderful person. He is an elegant writer. I just so happen to be in the middle of his Jefferson book. So I dropped in on his speech today, and I heard it from him, that we are on the precipice in America, implying that unless Joe Biden remains in the White House, we're all finished. Democracy will be gone. And this is the new narrative. I wrote this down. This is Kamala. Her husband, Doug Imhoff, was interviewed over the weekend by Rita Braver at CBS News, and he said the following, quote, "Democrats have to win this election because literally our country and literally the world depends on us winning." And that kind of hyperbolic, hysterical narrative is gaining currency, as if the earth will stop spinning on its axis and crash into the sun if Donald Trump sets foot again in the White House. And, in my lifetime, I can recall from the 1960s all the way through the present day, people saying, this is the most important election ever. So take it with a grain of salt. What disturbs me the most is the increasing use of lawfare, and that is warfare in a courtroom, weaponization of the law for purely political purposes. How did it happen? It happened because Democrats were in full panic mode. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. For 30, 40 years, I've been registered independently. I call balls and strikes the best I can. And this offends me, this lawfare. And it happened now against Donald Trump because of the polls. Democrats were not just alarmed, they were utterly terrified as Joe Biden's poll numbers spiraled downward like an out-of-control train. And something had to be done to put the emergency brakes on what is, I think, a failed presidency. Every major policy that Biden instituted proved to be immensely unpopular. His biggest calamity, opening the southern border, inviting millions of illegals who overwhelmed cities and states. I watched it unfold in New York City. Taxpayers at first were agitated. Then they became downright angry, particularly at the cost. $450 billion per year. You can look it up, the Center for Immigration Studies, a congressional report, all of it based on Homeland Security data. $500 billion a year. Hardworking Americans are footing the bill for that. It's free everything. Then there's Joe's eponymous program, Bidenomics, devoted to profligate spending. When you borrow and print trillions of dollars in a very short period of time, what happens? The currency is devalued, prices go up. It's fundamental economics 101. Predictably, it triggered historic inflation. Former Treasury Secretary, a Democrat, Summers, warned about it Stephen Ratner, also at Treasury, a Democrat, warned about it. Don't do it. They said, you will trigger inflationary pressure that we have not seen in a generation. And it happened, a 40-year high. And it left most Americans struggling. 2/3 of middle-class workers are suffering financial hardship. Half of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. On average, prices are 19% higher since Joe Biden took office. All you have to do is check the CPI index, seasonally adjusted. One of the canards that Joe loves to peddle is, inflation was 9% when I took office. No, Joe, it was 1.4%. You triggered it to 9%. And yes, it has slowed over the last couple of years, now down to 3%, but the cumulative effect puts the average prices at 20% higher. Some of them 30%, 40%, 50% higher. But Joe thinks Bidenomics has been a panacea for everyone. His soft on crime attitude that has done nothing to help cities that have devolved into war zones. I set up an Uber account for my daughters. I have forbid them to go into the subway system. I'll pay for you to take Ubers in Manhattan. That's why finally the governor took action, a Democrat, and called in the National Guard. It is a dystopian hellhole, which is why I don't live or work in New York City anymore. I live on Hilton Head Island. Normally, I'm wearing tennis shorts. I have a home studio. Nobody can see my tennis or golf shorts. I throw on a tie and a coat. I don't want to live in New York City anymore. It's too dangerous, the taxes are too high, and people like me are not wanted there. His climate agenda has reversed our nation's energy independence, and who pays for that? You do. Citizens are paying a steep price at the pump and for increased cost of transporting goods because the fuel costs are so high. His solution, Joe Biden's big solution now, is to raise taxes by $5 trillion. In foreign affairs, Joe Biden's bungled Afghanistan retreat was a national humiliation. His weakness invited Russia to invade Ukraine. China threatens Taiwan. Iran escalated its terrorism, knowing full well that a doddering U.S. president will do little or nothing about it. His policies freed up $70 billion for Iran. And recently, what did the mullahs do? They increased their uranium stockpile for nuclear weapons grade level. So much for Joe Biden's quiet diplomacy with Tehran. They rightly think he's a fool, and they're taking advantage of him. It calls to mind what former Defense Secretary Bill Gates once said in an interview. Quote, Joe Biden has been wrong about every foreign policy and national security issue for the past 4 decades. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is your president. Or as Barack Obama once warned to a friend, quote, don't underestimate Joe's ability to F things up. I cleaned that up because the Reverend's over here. Obama wasn't wrong. Biden is the master of the misstep, which is ironic since these days he has trouble walking or even thinking. His declining mental state has only made matters worse. A decrepit 81-year-old president vowing to seek a second term despite what voters think. A shocking 86% of voters say he is too old to hold that job.
And believe it or not, a whopping 73% of those people are Democrats. And for good reason. Joe Biden thinks Macron is Mitterrand, who's dead. The German chancellor is Helmut Kohl, who is still quite dead. In public appearances, Joe Biden seems dazed and confused. He wanders around aimlessly across a stage, shaking hands with imaginary people as he wobbles off. His words are often garbled and mumbled. He gets lost in the middle of a thought. He shuts his eyes, and you feel like saying, could somebody please take his pulse? But he's just fine. He's spry, the media keeps telling us. No, he is not. Dementia does not miraculously get better over time, and Joe's senility is in fact so bad that the special counsel Robert Hur refused to prosecute him over stolen classified documents because, quote, he's an elderly man with a poor memory. In other words, those of us who are lawyers would say he's incompetent to stand trial, but somehow he's competent to be president of the United States, the leader of the free world. It makes no sense. And it is truly frightening that Joe Biden holds the reins of power, making daily decisions that affect 333 million Americans and people worldwide. But his handlers at the White House, and particularly Joe Biden's family, are addicted to power. So they prop him up like a rag doll and lie to our faces by insisting he's sharp, he's sentient, when we know with our own eyes and ears that he is not anywhere else but Washington, D.C., and that would be called elder abuse. It's like Weekend at Bernie's. They drag him around with a dopey grin and his aviator sunglasses, pretending he is conscious, and he's not. There is not a chance, in my judgment, that Joe Biden can make it through a second term. Father Time comes for us all, and from a mental standpoint, Joe Biden's hourglass is just about out of sand. But don't worry, Kamala is waiting in the wings. She is ready to giggle her way through the remainder of his term. They should change their campaign slogan, re-elect mumbles and giggles. I told that one to Trump. Let's see if he uses it. Americans are smart. They see what's going on. And that's why Biden's approval rating is dropped like the Hindenburg, fast and burning. People remember that they were better off when Donald Trump was president. It's that simple. Biden has made a wreck of everything, which means that voters now have what is essentially a bad case of buyer's remorse. Biden sold himself as a moderate, but ended up governing as the most liberal president in American history. He promised to unify and, quote, end this uncivil war. 4 years later, that war is raging on, and no one has been more divisive than Joe himself. Americans were, in a word, snookered. You were lied to. But power, as I say, is intoxicating. It's addictive. Something had to be done to keep Joe in office despite those abysmal poll numbers. And that is when Biden Democrats had this grand epiphany. The best defense is a good offense, so their strategy was quite simple: knock out the opponent with a flurry of civil and criminal prosecutions, manipulate the legal system to damage or delegitimize Donald Trump. Classic warfare, the weaponization of law, for political gain. And Joe Biden, mind you, was in on it. He personally lobbied for the prosecution of Donald Trump. The plan was hatched on a particular day in the White House. The president's aides deliberately leaked the story to the New York Times, which promptly published it, and it read, quote, "Biden confided to his inner circle he believed Trump was a threat to democracy and should be prosecuted." Now, understand Joe Biden couldn't simply order his Attorney General, Merrick Garland, sycophant that he is, to criminally charge his political adversary. So the clever ploy was to send the message through the media. And when the Times story was published, April 2nd, 2022, Attorney General Merrick Garland got the message loud and clear. Not long thereafter, he appointed Jack Smith special counsel to investigate Donald Trump. 2 federal criminal indictments followed. Meanwhile, 2 ardent Biden supporters who served as local prosecutors in Georgia and New York launched their own criminal indictments against Trump. And to do it, they had to contort statutes, mangle evidence, twist facts to conjure up what I regard as a lawyer as purely specious charges. At the same time, you'll recall, others tried to banish Trump from the ballots by bastardizing an arcane provision in the Constitution's 14th Amendment, and only the backstop of the United States Supreme Court stopped them from succeeding. Throughout all of the civil and criminal cases that were brought, the mainstream media has played a critical role. In unison, they have declared Donald Trump guilty in the court of public opinion before any trial ever began. The fix was in. Talk about collusion between Biden Democrats and the media. All of these cases happen to have one common denominator. Each one was politically motivated, and all were timed so that the trials would occur right now during the presidential campaign to interfere in the election. They want to take your votes away from you, and they want to decide the election. By design, this was to benefit Joe Biden to the detriment of Donald Trump, and it was no coincidence. Here's a coincidence for you, if you believe in such things. Jack Smith was appointed on the very same day that Nathan Wade, the prosecutor in the Fulton County case, came to the White House and billed an 8-hour meeting there. And that's not the only coincidence. On that day, Matthew Colangelo, Biden's number 3 at the Department of Justice, left the DOJ, his lofty position, to take a job prosecuting Donald Trump in a far lower level job in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. Jack Smith, Nathan Wade, Matthew Colangelo, representing all 4 criminal cases against Donald Trump happening on the very same day. What Biden Democrats never envisioned is that Americans would see their legal dirty tricks for exactly what they are: a pernicious attempt to steal an election by stopping Trump from retaking the White House through an abuse of our justice system. Instead of ruining him, it fortified his popular support. People came to see Donald Trump not as a villain, but as a victim of unscrupulous political enemies who deployed lawfare to destroy him. And it's not the first time. The original lawfare, the original sin, if you may, was the Russia hoax. I wrote 2 books about it. Hillary Clinton invented the collusion narrative together with the Democratic National Committee. They secretly funded the phony dossier, leaked it to the media, delivered it to the FBI. James Comey and his Confederates knew at the outset it was pure fiction. But they used it as a pretext to launch a dilating criminal investigation of Donald Trump. They weaponized the law to drive him from office. And along the way, they lied to the FISA court and they deceived the judges to unlawfully gain a warrant to spy. No one, and this is the important part, no one was ever held accountable, which only further incentivized the uses of the lawfare that we're witnessing today. So let's talk about the lawfare. I'm going to sit on the chair, and I've got a few reminder notes, but I want to talk more casually about these cases. Let's begin with the Alvin Bragg case. Does any voter care what 12 liberal New Yorkers think about Donald Trump? I'm telling you, when people step into the voting booth, they're not thinking about, what 12 people in Manhattan did months earlier. What they're thinking about is how they're struggling to make ends meet. They're thinking about how when I go to the grocery store and get in line, I can't buy all of the food I need to feed my children. They're thinking about when I go to the gas station, I can only fill it up halfway, just enough to get to work and home because of inflation. So, frankly, I don't think in the end the criminal conviction in Manhattan is going to make much difference. Now, I have seen mixed poll results. I have seen some polls that say Biden has jumped up 2 or 3 points after the conviction in Manhattan. I've seen other polls that show it doesn't make any difference. Polls are meaningless at this point. It's too early. Historically, people really don't start paying attention until after Labor Day. However, this Thursday might alter that equation. The presidential debate happening far earlier than ever in history. And, there are going to be a lot of people tuning in to see how Joe Biden holds up and how well Donald Trump does. I find it revealing that, Joe's been sequestered at Camp David as they're trying to train him with answers, while Trump, without a care in the world, has been barnstorming across the country in a variety of states, continuing to campaign. What's his condition going to be? What's Biden's condition going to be on Thursday? I have no idea. I did see him at the State of the Union address. Tried decaf Joe. It was a bit of a shout fest. I don't know if he was juiced up or not. Who knows? You can bet we'll never find out. But, Joe Biden's dirty fingerprints, as I say, Matthew Coangelo leaving the DOJ, number 3, and you're going all the way down to a local prosecutor's office. And the moment he arrived, the very first day it was announced that he was going to head up the case against Donald Trump. And a Joe Biden-connected law firm lent Mark Pomerantz and 2 colleagues for the cause. Pomerantz later wrote a book saying, I was willing to do it for free. I wanted to nail Donald Trump. These are the kinds of people that have abandoned their principal duty as a prosecutor to see that justice is done fairly and equitably. No, they want to nail one guy. So they conjured up the most cockamamie, convoluted theory that I have ever seen in my 44 years as a lawyer. A case that would have been brought against no one not named Trump. This is, as I wrote in a column, this was a trial in search of an imaginary crime. It doesn't exist anywhere in the law. They charged him with falsifying business records, which is normally a civil fine. But if your name's Donald Trump, they're going to come after you criminally. The problem is the statute of limitations expired years earlier. It was based on reimbursement payments for so-called hush money to Stormy Daniels, which, by the way, is perfectly legal. You know, television networks pay people off to remain silent and sign non-disclosure agreements. Every business in America does it. It's perfectly legal. But if you sat inside that courtroom in Manhattan during the trial, you thought that that was a high crime and misdemeanor, you know, that deserved capital punishment. That's how it was presented. The problem with the business records, how do we activate them now that the statute of limitations has expired? Somebody had the bright idea, I know, we'll tie it to a secondary crime that elevates it to a felony so that it beats the statute of limitations, but we'll never tell the accused or the American public what that secondary crime is. Great! Let's go with that. Love that theory. You could just hear them in the Manhattan DA's office. And that is what they did. The defense did exactly what they should have done. They filed a motion called a Bill of Particulars, citing the Sixth Amendment. You must tell the accused the specific accusations against him so he can defend himself. There's a reason it's in the Sixth Amendment, the Bill of Rights, because it's important. You cannot prosecute somebody, put them behind bars, without telling them why. To this day, even after the conviction, we don't know the why. What was the secondary crime? Was it a federal election law violation? Was it a tax law violation? Was it a further mysterious falsification of records violation? We don't know. During the course of the trial, with the witnesses and the presentation of the evidence, the prosecution never said. And the judge allowed them to get away with it. Only at the end, during the judge's jury instructions, did he reveal it's not one, it's not two, you can pick from a menu of 3. And you do not have to be unanimous in your decision. Now, you don't have to be a lawyer to know that unanimity in a criminal case is a bedrock principle. And so you have here 2 egregious due process violations. The failure to tell the defendant the crime he's charged with, the secondary crime. And there are a string, by the way, of Supreme Court cases says you have to do that. You have to tell an individual not only every element of the primary crime, but the secondary crime as well. And there are a string of cases that say it all has to be unanimous. But the judge said, no, if 4 of you like that tax law violation, and 4 of you like, that false records and 4 like that campaign fine, you can all then convict based on that, utterly destroying the principle of unanimity. Now, these are due process violations. If this case had been tried in federal court, that would never have happened. So the question now becomes, on appeal, will the appellate courts in New York State do anything about it? Will they toss this case out with a scathing rebuke of Alvin Bragg and his unprincipled, unscrupulous prosecutors, or will they rubber stamp it? I have no idea. My guess is Trump probably will only get relief in the federal courts because federal judges actually care about due process. They care about constitutional principles. Which is why, by the way, there is a new bill working its way through the U.S. Senate and the House. Tom Tillis, North Carolina, is pushing it, and that is any future president and former president must be given a choice when criminally charged to have their case heard in either state or federal court. It should always be in federal court. And by the way, members of Congress and federal workers, they get that choice. A former president of the United States doesn't get that choice. There's one remedy for you. I'm confident that this conviction in Manhattan will get overturned, likely by the federal courts, but it takes time and it'll be too late. The election will have been had. The Fani Willis case doesn't need much discussion. She drove that case based on power and money and greed, and she self-destructed. You all know the story. I don't need to repeat it. That case, because of her, and it was never a racketeering case, by the way. Racketeering is a sophisticated, highly organized criminal enterprise, and the efforts after the election were about the most disorganized thing I've ever seen. The Jack Smith J6 case, that probably will not also take place. The immunity decision by the Supreme Court may happen at the end of this week, as well as the obstruction decision. Either way, the case will have to be remanded back to the trial court level, and then that'll take months and months and months, so it's not going to happen before the election. The classified documents case, it looks as though that will also be delayed. There is actually, notwithstanding what you hear in the media, a competent, thoughtful judge who cares about the rights of the accused who's handling that case. So, time to open it up for questions. Sorry, I tend to be a little long-winded when I get going. My daughters tell me that all the time. Dad, could you be concise?
Hello, hello. Still done. Q&A, let me remind you before you all leave that this is an unusual week for us here because on Friday, in this same place, Amity Shlaes will be here. She's a renowned author, best-selling author of the New York Times. She will be here at 3 p.m. this Friday, so to keep that in mind. Questions? You have to come around and stand here. Later that same afternoon, okay. Speak, I'll hold. I'll hold.
Okay. Thank you, Greg.
Sure.
Question about the Manhattan case.
Yeah.
There has been some talk about the possibility that they may try to push it up to the Supreme Court so it gets out of the way and not interfere with the election. In your legal analysis, your experience, what kind of chance is that likely to happen?
Probably not a great chance. I actually wrote a column making the same argument that appears on Fox News several weeks ago, very shortly after. And I said, there is a way, and I identify it in my column, to get this case front and center before the U.S. Supreme Court. so that a final decision can be made before the election, because exigent circumstances exist, and that is one of the bases upon which you can seek relief for due process violations. I think the Trump defense team has decided they may go that route, but they're waiting until the conviction is actually entered on the day of the sentencing. It's a bit of a, legal, loop that you have to go through. But they feel they have to wait until sentencing is rendered and the conviction is actually entered. But I think they're considering taking it right to Supreme Court. Thanks for the question.
Gregg, thank you so much for your objectivity in understanding the law in contrast to the subjectivity I hear on MSDNC. My question would be, what's your worldview of law? What worldview shaped your understanding of law? And would you consider being in a debate with one of these analysts on MSNBC?
You were. I mean, you were on MSNBC.
I was for 4 years at MSNBC. And I left because I saw what was going on. And I walked out the door with 6 months remaining on my contract and said, I'm out of here. What shapes my view of the look? I care deeply about the Constitution, and I'll give credit to John Meacham today. I mean, he was extolling the virtues of and the brilliance of our founders, and they created, yes, an imperfect document, but my goodness, how perfect was it in so many ways. And I've always cared about the Constitution, which is why my most recent book is The Constitution of the United States and Other Patriotic Documents. And I think that is the fabric that binds, the threads that bind the fabric of our country. And without it, we cannot stand. So that's what shapes my views. Really, I am forever returning to the Constitution when a legal issue comes up, and I consider the constitutional ramifications. Yes?
Thank you for your remarks. Give us your insight. We all come from a family or a group of people we know, both conservatives and liberals, but it seems like the DNC and recently this sort of lawfare issue has been so outrageous that people see that this is just a big sham. I mean, when did sort of the genesis of these ideas come out? And I mean, I even think liberals see that it's sort of a ruse and not sort of substantive. And doesn't that sort of self-destruct at some point in time?
Yeah, I think it does. I hope it does. So there are two things I can address there. I know I must be saying something right when, of all people, the former disgraced governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, agrees with me and said this case should never have been brought in Manhattan. And he went so far as to say that the Letitia James absurd, ludicrous civil fraud case, in which truly the worst judge I've ever seen presided over it, Arthur Engoron, rhymes with moron. And I will say that Ellie Honig over at CNN was the Lone Ranger when he stood up and criticized the Manhattan case brought by Alvin Bragg. I kudos to him for having the courage to do that in a hostile environment like that. So what was the second part of your question? I've now forgot. I'm having a senior moment, ladies and gentlemen.
Don't these sort of self-destruct over time?
Yeah, I think it has to play out. And I think, I hope that the people behind this realize in the end how utterly destructive it was, and not in the way they envisioned. There's been a lot of talk that if Trump wins, it's time for retribution. There's been talk that, local district attorneys in various states, Oklahoma or whatever, should bring cases against the likes of Joe Biden when he leaves office and the Homeland Security Secretary and others in the administration. Two wrongs don't make a right. I am against retribution in any form, vengeance in any form. It's merited, given what they did, but it's fundamentally wrong to do it. So I hope it plays itself out, and I hope in the long run America learns a lesson. And one of the ways that those people who brought the lawfare cases will learn the hard way is at the ballot box in November. I mean, in a constitutional republic based on democratic principles, it is always the ballot box that is the ultimate remedy.
Oh, thank you. My name is Janet Riley, and I congratulate you on having this event to provide an alternative point of view. I'm working on a book about the Chautauqua movement. I was so inspired last summer when I came here and heard Braver Angels present, and the need to have meaningful dialogue that is respectful and to really hear both points of view. So I think it's so important that Chautauqua do that. And you just said two wrongs don't make a right, and you mentioned hyperbole. I have to admit, I have a question for you. When you said that Joe Biden had Alzheimer's or dementia, whatever you called it, you said he was decrepit. I'm concerned that that is only more hyperbole, and I'm wondering how we depolarize America when we respond to what we believe is hyperbole with more hyperbole, because I did Google, and the Alzheimer's Association issued a statement begging people to stop diagnosing either Donald Trump or Joe Biden with Alzheimer's.
Yeah,
so just
I get
it's
it.
a question for you.
I didn't use the term Alzheimer's. That's very specific and requires a diagnosis. But the broad generic term of senility or dementia is something I think we're all familiar with. It's been my family. I've witnessed it. I'm watching it unfold right now in my family. And I think those broad terms are merited for use here. Brit Hume, who I admire tremendously at Fox News, was the first one to use the term senility over and over and over again to describe Joe Biden. And he explained himself, and it made perfect sense. And since then, I have noticed there's been a growing acceptance among others in the media to use the same term for Joe Biden. It strikes me that his failing memory, as identified by the special counsel, constitutes a form of senility or dementia. Yeah.
No, I'll take the microphone.
You're not going to have the microphone.
What?
Talk into it. Talk into it.
I find it highly offensive that you seem to be ignoring what happened on January 6, 2021, when the Capitol building was stormed by supporters of Trump, and Trump stayed in the White House watching it all on TV, probably supporting it because he didn't want to allow Biden to be elected president. That's right. Even though it won the office, he was doing this to prevent them from electing him. Mm-hmm. And I find that highly offensive that you seem to be ignoring that whole horrible episode in U.S. history.
Thank you. Answer that.
Well, in fact, I haven't ignored it. I've spoken about it extensively. I've written about it extensively. Well, if you would like to give me another 20 minutes, I'd be happy to address it, but I was getting a hard rap from Paul here. I'd be happy to talk about the J6 lawfare case against Donald Trump, because I think what people don't understand is that while he exercised his right in various courtrooms to contest the outcome, claiming ballot fraud, improper vote counting, and so forth, all of those failed, and I wrote about it. I even went so far as to say his behavior that day will be an ugly stain on his legacy for the rest of his life. For you to suggest I've ignored it is simply wrong, ma'am.
Question only, Sam, okay?
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ready? Oh, thank you. I'm going to ask you to look into ask a question about what's happened in the past and then look into the future a little bit. Why is it that we haven't heard much about the crime of treason? Or in the future, is that when it is more likely to happen?
The crime of treason with respect to what?
Biden.
Oh, all right. I've actually written and talked on air about it as well in the context of the influence peddling schemes that his son appears to have been running, netting some $32 million from Russia, China, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Romania. The title of one of my columns was, Joe Biden was the closer. Any of you have ever watched Suits, you know that Harvey Specter was the closer, right? He would just show up and his mere presence closed the deal. That's the way this was. That's the way Hunter Biden would go to all those countries I just named. And he appeared to have been selling promises of access and influence to his powerful father. And Joe would close the deal. He'd show up at meetings or he'd get on the telephone, and that would signify to those paying the money that when you need Joe Biden, he'll be there for you. And you're talking about, rich countries. It's a, drop in the bucket for them to secure some potential influence in America. Now, is selling out your country for profit treason? Arguably it is. And I have said so in my columns. I've said so on air. It constitutes a violation, in my judgment, of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, a Foreign Agents Registration Act, a violation of the bribery and conspiracy statutes. And I think, I think what the impeachment committee has done, instead of moving toward impeachment, what they've done is they've used their power to uncover a lot of the incriminating evidence of Joe Biden's complicity, and they are presenting it to the American people. James Comer will continue to do so up until the election. And I've always been against the idea of impeaching Joe Biden or Alejandro Mayorkas in an election year. Leave it up to the American people. They're smart enough. They have good judgment. Let them decide who should be president. Don't remove an existing president in an election year.
Thank you, Mr. Jarrett, very much.
Thank you.
I have a question. Biden has recently issued an executive order to allow illegal migrants to get voter registration forms. What can be done about this?
Well, by law, it's a crime for somebody who is here illegally to vote in a federal election. So ultimately, that's the solution, is to enforce the law. I'm not sure I buy into all the conspiracy theories that Joe Biden opened the borders so that he could get new voters. I think he just signed on to the woke agenda, open borders, everybody should be allowed to come here. We're a rich country. We should be paying for them to be here, which has turned out to be $500 billion a year in counting. I mean, the burden on law enforcement, on housing, on the medical care system, on the welfare system is just breathtaking. So,
final question.
I wonder if you could take a look at the Trump derangement syndrome, what the Wall Street Journal has called the Trump derangement syndrome on the left, and whether that is Trump specific, and whether the kind of treatment that the right is getting from the left now is specific to Trump, or whether another candidate who comes along of national stature, whether we're going to return to normalcy or whether this is the new norm.
I think it's specific to Donald Trump. I really do. There's something about him that is so triggering to some people. You know, I know the guy. I've interviewed him many times. You know, he's a smart, charming fellow. But I think they hold him to a different standard. And I'll give you an example, and it's in partial response to the woman who complained I wasn't addressing J6. Democrats did the exact same thing in the 2016 election. They appeared on January 6th of 2017, and they conducted the exact same kind of maneuver headed by Maxine Waters and Jamie Raskin and Benny Thompson and others to replace Donald Trump with Hillary Clinton, with an alternate selection of electors. And it did not succeed. And it wasn't the first time. Democrats did it in 2000 and 2004 elections. Suddenly, when Donald Trump does the exact same thing, it's a crime. But when Democrats do it, it's fine because it's called for under the Electoral Count Act, which, by the way, has since been revised in the last couple of years so that it won't happen in the future. But it has happened over and over and over again. And again, when Democrats do it, they are exercising their legal rights under the Electoral Count Act. But when Donald Trump does it, he gets criminally prosecuted by Jack Smith, who, by the way, I'm going to be curious to see the ruling from Judge Aileen Cannon in the Florida case as to whether Jack Smith should be removed as special counsel, because, you know, I read the brief by Ed Meese and the other former Attorney General, gosh, what's his name? Really smart guy, and he was a former federal judge. They make a compelling argument that because Jack Smith was never approved in any position by the United States Senate, that violates the special counsel statute. And I tend to think they're right. And, you know, I'm not the Lone Ranger who thinks that this is an issue. It was brought up by Justice Clarence Thomas at the immunity oral argument as well. So it'll be very interesting. The argument was on Friday before Judge Cannon. I'm going to be interested to see what happens. There was another hearing today before her. I think there's another one tomorrow. So stay tuned. There's lots of action to play out. Thank you so much. Thank you.